Take it away.
All right. So tonight we're speaking about policy design, the focus being cybersecurity, but I think you'll find the majority of this content is applicable regardless whether it's cybersecurity or other policy. So quick, make sure I can actually get to the next slide. Quick intro of who I am. So I currently work as a security architect for IHG. I actually run our architecture team for security, and I've been with IHG full time for about almost 2 years now. Coming up in August, be 2 years. And I've been in security for quite a number of years, as you can see by this timeline. And I actually worked at IHG when I was at JB Consulting for a number of years as well. So I've been here for a long time. So tonight we're going to cover a couple different things. We're going to cover why do we have cybersecurity policy. I want to talk about some of the legal implications of having a policy in general, because just putting something on paper is committing yourself to a policy. Talk about how do you come up with policy. So where do you draw the material from or for policy? For cybersecurity, we actually have a lot of really good source material. I don't know, I've never been in HR. I don't know if other policies have the same ability to draw on existing what we call authority documents or not. But at least in cybersecurity, we are provided that luxury. So I'll talk through that. Talk through some of the business considerations. Where does policy usually sit within a cybersecurity team? And some other things to think about when you're designing it. Obviously, we need to talk through the policy life cycle. There's quite a few phases in there. And then dive in a little bit more around what is actual content that goes into a cybersecurity specific policy. Talk about how do we enforce it. And then we need to also speak about, okay, what happens when there's an exception to policy? So overall goals are understanding the policy life cycle, and then what are the overall ramifications of implementing a policy. So first topic, why do we have a cybersecurity policy to begin with? I've got on the left-hand side kind of a framework high level showing the different types of pieces that go into the governance of documentation. And this, again, irrelevant though, of whether it's security or not, right? So you have a strategy typically set by your business, not IT, not the security team, but set by the business. And that's laying out the plan of how do we want to accomplish our goals. So goals even sit above strategy, if you will, or as a component of it. You have policy, that's the next level. And these are the rules that are going to help you make decisions to know if you're moving towards or away from the plan. You have standards, and as a security architect, I actually am responsible for our security standards. I am not responsible for policy, but we'll talk about that later when we get to the org. And standards are more, how do you actually go about making that policy effective? So it's not down to the detailed step-by-step instructions. I'm going to give you an example in the next slide of what do each one of these look like. But the standard is more, these are the things that have to be done. These are the regulations that need to be in place in order to support policy, et cetera. Operating procedures are more that detailed step-by-step instruction. And then guidelines are not necessarily mandatory. They're general things on how to approach supporting all the other documentation above it. So a policy, the main reason we have to have it is really that bottom bullet there, right? We have to have the ability to measure, audit, and enforce what our desired security capabilities are. If you remove security, it's general to any policy, but from a security perspective, I cannot enforce my capabilities or the rules, if you will, from a security perspective if I don't have something to measure against. So the policy, it's that foundational basis for what does management expect for what you are going to do, what are you responsible to do depending on your role in order to secure the organization. And then again, like I said, on the left-hand side, they're also they're the rules to make decisions and lays out what you can and cannot do. Any questions on this slide before I move forward? Okay, so let's go to the next one. We'll go through an example of each one of these. So left-hand side's the same as the previous one. The right-hand side is trying to walk through an example from top to bottom showing the detail. So the strategy, I came up with this on my own, so I apologize if it's not great, but organization will ensure timely and secure communication with its customers, right? It's important for the business to be able to talk to our customers quickly and securely. So that's the strategy. That's what we want to make happen. The policy says organizational email that contains confidential or restricted information must be transmitted using an improved encryption method. So high level, it's a rule. Did you send the email? Did the email contain confidential or restricted information? If yes, you have to use an approved encryption method to send it. That's all it says. Okay, how do I know what an approved encryption method is? That's where I go to my standard, and it tells me that an encryption must be based on an industry tested and accepted algorithm. And then I give some examples here, right? An operating procedure, I picked one just randomly that's talking about implementing encryption, right? So it's talking about TLS version 1.2, it's talking about different ciphers and how you would go about creating those or setting the configuration settings in whatever this example is drawn from. So it's much more detailed about a specific item, in this case, Java 7, right? And then the guideline is, so the guideline would be more in like training documentation or maybe a communication that's sent out about, hey, we just published a policy about sending out email. So the language would be more along the lines of being friendly. When sending an email, ensure the email client is set via the preferences to require TLS version 1.2 or higher for all network connections. So it's pretty pointed. Hey, you need to have version 1.2 enabled. You have to set this in your client. Hopefully this helps give a little more flavor, if you will, or idea of where the policy level sits within these documentation sets. All right, so next is legal implications. I wanted to give an example here. I have two different examples actually, where if you have something in or out of your policy, you can actually get into legal trouble because you said or didn't say something in your policy. So the first one is actually from the GDPR, where the Information Commissioner's Office was, they published a report on British Airways a breach from a couple of years ago. This is back, I think in 2018 was when it happened. And so I've bolded the parts to pay attention to here, right? So they had a network access control policy, and in it, it said that multi-factor authentication will be incorporated for all remote network access, etc. And then they said in the report, it appears that British Airways itself considered MFA to be an appropriate measure to mitigate the risk of unauthorized remote access into their network. And then they said, but of these applications that were hosted in their Citrix Access Gateway, which is where the breach occurred, 13 of them did not have MFA. The blanked out areas were blanked out in the report, so there's nothing we can see there. And then they call out that British Airways did not provide a satisfactory explanation of why they didn't need MFA for those applications. And they even required it again, they're saying, to comply with the policy that said they needed to have it. And so this was used by the Information Commissioner's Office to lay out the case for why they were fining British Airways for being in breach of GDPR. This is one of many things that happened as part of that, but I thought this was a very good example to say, you put it in your policy, but you didn't uphold your own policy. And so just by the act of putting it into policy, you've now made yourself legally liable for something.
Hey, Joseph, we do have a hand up, so let's see what the question is. Go ahead, James. James, you might have a hardware switch on your microphone.
Check.
There you go.
Thank you, sir. Sorry about that. Now, I was just going to ask on the previous notes, you were going down strategy, policy, rules, all that. Where in the example you're providing here do you provide hard, this is the way do you ever provide a hard example of this is the way we expect to see it? I mean, to me, that could show up in either operating procedure or guideline area. But
usually operating procedure is where you would say, like, actual configuration settings. A good
Right.
example comes to mind, right, is around logging. I get this question a lot. What do I need to be logging off of a server, for example? So the standard will say we will log these 5 types of events. The operating procedure would then say, for this specific tool or this specific system, this is the exact log name, this is the exact location you're going to send it to, etc.
A reference ID, whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, definitely. Any other questions before I jump into the second example here?
I had a question. So based off what you said, the Information Commissioner's Office gave a penalty to this specific organization because they put in their policy to have multi-factor authentication. Are you saying that had they not had that policy in place, that they would not be punished for it?
Essentially, obviously, they would have still been fined because they still, under GDPR, did not protect the data accurate or enough. And so it was leaked, it was breached. But again, this is part of a legal case as part of this document that's saying these were the 50 things you did wrong, and one of them was here. So they did increase the fine because of this. So they probably would have gotten a lower fine if they hadn't have called themselves out essentially in their own policy and not upheld their policy. Now, if they had had it in their policy, but then they had potentially some reason why they didn't find it necessary, right? It's because that last clause, why it was deemed unnecessary, they may have had a perfectly good reason if they had accurately or sufficiently documented that, maybe as part of a policy exception, which we'll talk about later. Then the commission may have said, okay, that's sufficient. We won't ding you for that particular application not being protected by MFA, but they did not do that.
And to that point, had they have implemented multi-factor authentication and the issue still, or the breach, or whatever we want to call it, whatever it was, if that still occurred, does that mean that they're not liable for that specific issue, I guess, or result of the information leaking?
So ultimately, as an individual or as an entity, right, the company would have been held responsible for not protecting their data sufficiently. Well, the issue here is twofold. One is they didn't have MFA in place. So the commissioner could have said, you didn't have MFA, regardless of what it says in policy. You should have known that's an industry standard. You should have had MFA on these applications. And because the bad actor came in through this Citrix Access Gateway and you didn't have protection on it, therefore they were able to get to things they should not have. We're going to hold you liable. That's one thing. But on top of that, they are saying that British Airways said they thought MFA was the appropriate measure to mitigate this risk. They were aware of the risk, they are aware of all their applications, and yet they did not protect it. So I'm trying to think of another good example.
It's two edges of a knife. You're calling out what you need to protect yourself, and then you're not following through 100%.
Yeah,
all the
exactly.
way. So the 13 applications that were left open, for whatever reason, they may have had older authentication mechanisms. They may not have been able to handle MFA, whatever it is. And you find this everywhere you look.
Yeah. I mean, it could also simply be they had 243 applications. That's a lot. Maybe they just hadn't finished rolling it out. Maybe it was very costly for whatever reason to integrate MFA with these 13. That would have been sufficient, even if they had just logged an exception against their policy and said, we can't afford this right now. We know about it. It's on our roadmap. We're planning on getting to it in 2 years. We can't afford it. That probably would have been sufficient because the commissioner would say, you recognized it. You wanted to do something about it. You weren't able to at this time. We're not going to treat it as serious as you said you were going to do something and then you didn't do it.
Hey, Joseph, this is Robert Roberts. Quick question on that line of discussion. If they said they could do it, would would the regulator come back and say, well, you should have had some kind of other way to minimize that risk? And
Yes.
find them more, or would they just say, okay, we understand you couldn't do it?
So if I remember correctly, they also got dinged because they weren't logging appropriately. So even if they didn't have MFA, they still could have, for example, another mitigation might have been, we know that the people that log into our Citrix Access Gateway, they're always coming from the UK. We saw this login come in from, pick your poison, I don't know, Syria, Russia, whatever, right? Could have been the US. And so that could have potentially thrown an alert just because it was a IP address originating from a non-standard geographic location. That I don't remember if that was called out specifically or not, but that could have also been a mitigating risk. As long as they had documented it and were actually doing that, that would have been appropriate as well.
Right, because you get into, if you didn't do it, you said you were going to do it and you didn't keep your word. And then if you don't put it in your policy, then your fiduciary duty, you're negligent. Is basically what they say.
Yes, it's very difficult, and that's actually where the second one comes in. Because so good segue. PCI, right? It's a what's the term? An industry regulation. If you want to carry credit cards, the credit card brands say that's fine, but you got to follow our standard. And if you don't, we can fine you. That's part of the contract. And so they require you to have different policies and different controls within your policies. I call out some examples here. But just because you put in your policy, that doesn't actually provide any real security, right? You need to actually enforce that policy. So if you had just put it in your policy but didn't do anything about it, you could still be held liable. That's why you have a qualified security assessor for PCI in particular. They come through and actually validate that, yes, you have it in your policy, and yes, you also actually do it. Any other questions here? Okay. All right, so how do we go about building a policy? So like I mentioned, there's different authority documents we can draw on, and they can come from an international body. I've given some examples here. You can have a national body, or you can have an industry specific like PCI, or Underwriters Laboratory produces some. There's plenty of different authority documents to pull on, and most of them will include controls. They will just spell it out for you. And you can literally, in a lot of cases, copy paste and say, I want this as part of my policy. For our own, the company I work for right now, IHG, Intercontinental Hotel Group, we use a tool, and I may touch on this later, called the Unified Compliance Framework. And I don't necessarily recommend it. It's not the most user-friendly or great tool out there. There's a couple others I'm aware of. But what it tries to do is say, pick your authority documents, and I'm going to try to deduplicate all these different controls and say, here's the final list that you need to include in your policies and actually implement. So there are some tools out there that look at a lot of these, try to help you understand what's applicable to you and how do you deduplicate them. As I mentioned up here, you need to work with your legal department, your privacy department, and risk to really understand what are you responsible for. And you'd be surprised. So we're a hotel company. One of the ones that we have included as our authority documents is actually HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Why? Because some of our hotels have med spas. And so a med spa has to be compliant with HIPAA. So sometimes there's strange regulations out there you wouldn't necessarily know, but that's why you need to consult, in particular, legal. Okay.
Do you see this expanding overall? Like what you were talking about with HIPAA there, when HIPAA was initially released, it seemed to only apply to certain areas and categories, and that is granted grown out. And, anybody handling HIPAA documents or anything like that is control. PCI has done the same thing. Do you see that kind of creep in your scope and what you do?
Yes, but the reason is some of these frameworks, especially ones that are industry pushed, like High Trust, for example, it started off as a medical authority, if you will, or framework, but there's a lot of other industries that are starting to look at it and say, hey, you've done a really good job, and it really helps. Can we apply it? Can we have another flavor of it? Some of them, like NIST, the cybersecurity framework, they've started to look at how do we adapt the framework for specific industries. A lot of times too, what I've found is that different vendors will come to these authorities and say, hey, I'd like to showcase your framework or your regulations by doing a case study and showing how it applies to a specific industry, of course, using my tool. We actually saw that recently for the hospitality industry, where they went to NIST and did that exact thing. There's like 3 different vendors that partnered together to do that. So a lot of them can be cross industry, and I think that's how I see it growing. And then also different ones get updated over time. PCI is on version 3.2.1. They're about to release version 4. And so every time they change it, there's new controls. They either delete some, modify, or add, usually add quite a few.
Thank you.
Yeah, NIST cybersecurity framework also is on it's a couple versions in, I think. I don't remember what version we're on right now, but they definitely update over time.
It's definitely a couple in. I think, what is it, 853? Whatever, but most of the controls that I found in other frameworks seem to tie over to that at some level. Actually,
that's a great point, because there's the NIST cybersecurity framework itself, and then you have NIST 853 that sits underneath that. So the framework is more at the policy level, and then the 853 standard is really at that standard level, gets more granular. There is some crossover, but it's designed for government to implement standards that support the framework. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about business considerations. On the left-hand side, I'm trying to sketch out where does security policy sit and what is its function. So it's sitting in the middle, as you can see, and I'm trying to draw a line here to say it supports and informs. So it supports the strategy and the governance above it. From a security perspective, that rolls up into the corporate strategy, like I mentioned the first part. And then the policy also informs, everything that happens below from a security perspective. So training, controls, compliance, those all have to be informed by policy and support policy. And then security engineering, security operations, whether that's your SOC or your identity and access management teams, whatever they are, they need to ensure that they are following the training, following policy, and being compliant with what's being said. And then on the right-hand side, you have whatever other business units are applicable in that company. I've tried to call out the large ones, though, that have to integrate with and align with the security policy. You can't just write a security policy uninformed without knowing what your HR policy is, for example. If your HR policy says you can bring your own device and you can do whatever you want on it, but then your security policy says, no, you can't use your own device, you're going to have a conflict. So you need to work it out. So risk management sits typically in 2 spots. You'll have an overall enterprise risk management that's looking at physical risk. It's looking at financial risk, in terms of like money and exchange rates, all sorts of things there. And then you also have your internal security risk. You have your third-party risk management. Those will sit usually within the security function. I didn't draw them here, but they also have to align with your enterprise risk management teams. Security policy for our own, I can tell you, we have a whole policy around supply chain, and that has to align over to procurement so they know what we are saying we need to have in our contracts, as well as legal needs to know from a security perspective, to ensure that we're compliant with outside regulations as well as with our own internal policy. Because on top of PCI, on top of NIST or whatever authority documents we've picked, we can still say that's not good enough for us. We're still uncomfortable. We're going to add an additional control. We need procurement to know about that and align with it. Obviously, IT is very closely tied to information security. They need to be aware and compliant, and they also inform our policy, because a decision they make will impact what policy we need. Maybe they decide on their own, we're going to go cloud only. We're not going to have any on-prem data centers anymore. Well, then our policies probably need to shift to align with that change in how IT is being handled. And privacy and legal, it may be the same team, it may be split. Privacy is looking at, are we compliant with privacy laws like GDPR or the California Consumer Privacy Act or any of the other numerous privacy acts that are being enacted even as we speak. And they are usually looking at, are our contracts in place? Do we have data, what do they call them? DPAs, data protection agreements, I think, basically where we're sharing data with a third party. Are they treating our data responsibly and vice versa? And again, they all align to policy. So it doesn't have to sit within information security. It doesn't have to sit within information security governance. But a lot of times that seems to be one of the best homes for it. Okay. So policy lifecycle. I apologize if the font is small here. I've got on the left-hand side the life cycle itself, but I call out initially that there's a 0 step, if you will, which is budgeting. So it's like any other business process. You have to budget, you have to build it, train it, and measure it and adjust. So with budgeting, trying to call out, especially for the folks that are taking the course here, things like, what are the deliverables that have to be created as part of the policy lifecycle? What, doing a bottoms up or top down estimate of what are the tasks required? What teams are we dependent on? Who do we need to ask to review our policies? Are we going to have to provide them a charge code so that they can bill against our department to be able to support us? How long do we have to build this? How fast do we have to work? That's going to require, dictate the number of people we need to work on this. And so you have to develop a budget, and then you need to determine your authority documents. That's under scoping, and review the so I said review stakeholder policy recommendations. What I'm talking about here is it could be the CISO, it could be HR, but at a high level, who within the organization can help you determine what those authority documents are. I would say you definitely need your CISO to sign off on it, and your information security officer, and you need your legal as a bare minimum to say, yes, we know that this is what we have to be compliant with. If you have a separate compliance function, I would certainly include them, and there's probably others too. And then you're going to create the actual document. So if you have existing ones, you may update it. Otherwise, you may have to be creating from scratch. What we are actually going through at IHG right now is we've had existing ones for many years. We decided to invest in that UCF tool that I mentioned, the Unified Compliance Framework. And so we are revamping all of our policies this year. It's a very large initiative, and going through basically a complete rewrite. So every once in a while, you need to do that. But ultimately, I would say the goal is your policy really shouldn't have to change much. It's more if you decide that, okay, we now need to be compliant with a new authority document, that there's going to have to be a number of updates, or it could be also a large change in technology that may cause a shift in the controls. Once you've drafted it, you need to go review it with different stakeholders. You have to get their feedback, get them to buy in and say, yes, we can actually accomplish this policy. And then you also need to figure out, if you had existing policies, what are the gaps with those policies, so that you can not only educate people about what's changing, but you may also need some interim policy exceptions, because you may not be able to be compliant with your policy on day one when you go to publish it. Once you've...
So quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that what happened to British Airways?
Again, they didn't document it, though. That was the big issue.
Well, no, I'm with you. But I'm also, they weren't compliant for day one, and we're not sure what happened in between the start and the finish. And that was what the auditor was pointing out, right?
Yes.
Okay.
It is a fine line. I can because we're going through this year, right? We've had this discussion a couple times now with our legal department around, do we really want to put that in there now? If we really know we're not compliant with it, do we know roughly when we're going to be? If it's more than like 6 months, maybe we don't want to put it in now. We'll just put it in our backlog and say, we'll add this to policy next year. Let's try to get compliant before we actually go and stick it in there.
Gotcha.
So that's a great point.
What's the motivation to post something into the policy if you don't have to? To your point, saying, wait until we actually can implement it before we put in the policy. Why put in the policy at all when you're legally, tying yourself to a rope that you're going to have to pay at some point?
So 2 reasons come to my immediate mind. One is it may be required, like I called out for PCI, right? They say if you want to run credit cards, you have to have this in your policy. So if you were to if you want to pass the audit for that year, you would have to be able to show the auditor, yes, I have it in my policy. So you may not have a choice on the timeline. You have to get it in. So you may need to do that. Usually what happens with, like for PCI, for example, you go through the audit and you tell the auditor, look, I can't show that I'm compliant with this. We're not doing it today. Okay, fine. What's the mitigation? What's the remediation timeline? As long as you document it and you're tracking towards it, they're usually okay with you moving it along, but you still need it in your policy. Now, you could, get a little bit of extra time if you wanted to by just not putting in policy and letting the auditor catch that, but then it would just become a finding that you need to put it in there for next year. But the other reason I was thinking is it's a great tool, at least from a security perspective, to be able to drive maturity. So it may be something that you can't do today, but you really want to drive the business to do that and you're not making traction. If you can get them to agree to get it into policy, then you may be able to push them to move faster to actually go implement something to make something more secure. So it's both maturity and trying to drive maturity, as well as needing to be compliant with regulatory bodies. Those are the 2 main reasons I can think of.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So once you've drafted it, you've gotten your stakeholders review it, now you finalize it, you're ready to publish. So you need to communicate it out. So you need to publish it, and you need to think through, where do you publish it? So it may be in a spot that's very public. Typically that's what happens. So it'll be like on your intercompany web page or what have you. Maybe it's a SharePoint site, something like that, where everybody can review it. Sometimes some of the policies may have, depending on how they're written, they may have more confidential information, and they may be targeting specific groups of people within the business that they need to be compliant with, and it may not have to be general knowledge. So some of them may not be published for everybody to see, but something to keep in mind, you need to figure out where to publish them. And then you're also going to need to build communications and training, and go out and basically evangelize these policies, make sure people know about them, and work, and read them and actually implement them. It's funny because we're getting to that point of publishing our new policies as well. And we were having this discussion this past week because we know of some gaps between the old policies and the new policies. And so one of the suggestions was, well, in the training, we should just cover the gaps. And I was like, you're making a huge assumption that the people read the first one. If they didn't read the first one, they could care less what it said in the last one, in which case they don't need to know the gaps. They need to know what's in the current ones. So you definitely need to think about your audience and what do they need. If you have an organization where they are very good about reading and maintaining policy, maybe a financial organization, they tend to be, or maybe government, then you may not need to do as much. It may just be those updates to what they need to know, but it may also be, no, they need a reminder. We actually have policy. You should go read them. So as part of the publication, you need to put a date of when do these become actionable. So again, drawing on our example from this year, we're planning on publishing these in August, and then they will not actually become actionable until November. So it gives a few months for people to let it sink in, let them review, and start to open up those exceptions to, there may be things we don't know, and it could also be on the system level or the the software level, what have you. we may not have enough information at our level to know who it's going to impact, but until we put it out there and get everybody's eyes on it, we won't know. So we need to publish it. We need to give people time to read it, and then also to start to push back, essentially. Once they're actionable, then your compliance function usually steps in and says, okay, let's validate that these policies are actually in place and start to monitor compliance to those policies over time. And there's different ways of doing that. You can have somebody self-attest that, yes, I am compliant with policy. They've signed off on it. So now it's essentially a legal document saying I am doing X, that you can hold them accountable to. And then it could also be bringing in a third party to do some testing. Maybe, like, for example, PCI, we have to do penetration testing every year. Or it could be using a vulnerability scanner or many other tools. It could be trying to validate, policy might say for asset management, you have to keep an inventory of all your assets. Awesome. I've got my CMDB. I see all my assets in there. Now I run a network scan, and compliance is checking to make sure everything that shows up on the network is actually in my asset database. And then there may be some changes. Maybe you need to make some changes to policy because it's not clear. People are just interpreting it incorrectly and not applying it properly. It could be that we missed a control, and we realize once we start looking at it and trying to monitor it, that people are missing a step, and we need to call that out. So we add it to the policy. And it could also be that we realize that the way we worded it is really not accurate to the environment. Maybe we don't actually do things this way. It's not a regulatory requirement, or maybe there's some wiggle room and we can change how we're doing it and make the policy better. Or maybe strike something entirely if it's not really applicable. So these are living documents. They do change over time. Typically what will happen is you'll have a policy intake to get feedback, and policy will collect these, and then on a set schedule, they will make updates to the policy and republish the new versions. Typically, I'd say it happens once, maybe twice a year. It's not very common. So that's where the maintenance comes in, adjusting policies as required. And then if there are exceptions that are coming in, you risk accept and approve the exception, or you push back and say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept this. We're going to move forward. And we'll talk about that again towards the end. And if there are obsolete policies, then retiring them completely. Any questions here? Did I miss anything? Is there a component you think?
Yusuf, I got one question. This is Robert. Robert again. At your company, do you ever have to, are there situations or certain policies that you have to take to the board of directors, or
yes,
you have sign off an agreement?
That's a good point. Yes. I probably should have between review and communicate an approval step. So good catch. Yes, it depends on the organization, how large you are, etc. Our policies, I'm trying to remember who all needs to sign off on it. Our CISO definitely does. And then I believe we have essentially a policy review board that's at like the SVP level. It does not go, it does not go to our board, I don't believe. But it certainly goes up relatively high. Any other questions or points there? Yeah, definitely. Okay. So looking a little more at what's actually in the policy, I tried to give some examples looking at our own as well as outside of us, because some of these are not necessarily applicable, or we may have combined some of these in our own policies, but some of the high level topics, right? If you think about your general business activities, what does a business do, especially from an IT perspective, then you're almost always going to want the corresponding security policy on top of that. So you got asset management. I don't want to really read all of these. I'll let you do that. But these are the high level things that I would expect to see in the typical policy.
Joseph, this might be a good point to ask. Someone asked if we'll be able to get a copy of these slides to share
Sure.
Are you going to be willing to share them? Okay, great. That way you don't have to read them all. We can actually study them a little bit afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. Happy to send this over.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Knowing that security or any policy, it's imperative that the organization members, employees receive a copy. Is there special attention given to ensuring that everybody actually acknowledges a copy, or how do you guys look at that?
It does depend on the business. At my current company, we have a few overarching policies that we are required to sign off that we've read once a year. There's like an employee handbook that really is a bunch of policies within that. It does cover high level parts of security. So we actually provide some input from the security function to HR when they're writing that. They actually, this year, they published it without getting us to review it first. We had to go back and fix some things, which was a lot of fun. But there's that overarching one. We do not require people to review our security policies and sign off. That has not come up as a discussion at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So like Herb said, I'll send this out and you can read through them. If you have questions after this, by all means, always happy to have you contact me as well. So let's look a little bit more at how would we write a policy statement. So I gave a hypothetical example here. We're working at a hospital, they take credit cards. So we've been told that the CISO wants to use the NIST cybersecurity framework. That's our main policy framework. So regulatory perspective, we know we have to be compliant with HIPAA, and we're taking credit cards, so we know we have to use PCI. We're also using HITRUST to make sure that we are HIPAA compliant. So we have on the left-hand side, we have our different frameworks, NIST, HITRUST, and PCI. And I'm giving examples of duplicative controls here, right? So there's 3 different controls. They all say relatively similar things. One saying access permissions and authorizations are managed, incorporating the principles of least privilege and separation of duties. Then there's one saying that there has to be a formal, documented, and implemented user registration and deregistration procedure for granting and revoking access, which is essentially saying you need to manage your access. And then we have from PCI saying you have to document approval by authorized parties specifying required privileges when granting access. So if we look at those, if I had to write a policy to capture those 3 to make sure I'm actually compliant with all 3, I've tried to write this now on the right-hand side, and it actually turns into 4, unfortunately, but to spell this out in a way that it actually applies to hospitals. So first one is saying procedures must be documented for granting and revoking access to all information systems. So I have to have a procedure that documents how we do this. That's number 1. No, so I could audit that and say, show me your procedure. Number 2, hospital staff access, revocation of that access, and access privileges to information systems and associated data have to be approved by a line manager and documented somewhere. So again, I'm auditing. Please show me your documentation that shows that that line managers have signed off on all the access that I'm seeing in the system. Number 3, access documentation has to be provided upon request to the information security team. Most of our policies always call that out because honestly, it's not usually an issue, but every once in a while, somebody's like, well, why do you need to see that? Well, we have a policy that says we get access to that because we need to be able to show compliance as the security function. And then number 4, granted privileges must be commensurate with and not exceed the minimum required to perform the role. So this is, again, covering on the left-hand side the least privilege and separation of duties. So I'm not going to use the controls that came directly from the framework because they are overlapping to some extent. And I need to write it in a way that's actually implementable and testable, if you will, for each one of these so that I can show on an audit how we are meeting those compliance requirements. It's not easy. It takes a lot of wordsmithing.
I had a question. One of the things that learned in Dr. Manford's class is that you want to make sure that you're presenting the policy in a language that's easily digestible, with a broad audience.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like, based off of your experience writing policies, this is a difficult task, considering you're talking about, extremely technical technologies, I guess, and then, also putting it in a language that they can understand? Like, I would say that the fourth access control,
Mm-hmm.
that statement, I could argue that might be a little intense for just based off of the employees that I work with. It might be a little intense for them.
Mm-hmm. The grade level for reading there is a little more challenging. It's a fair point, absolutely, and I would agree. If you can simplify the wording, then and still get the same legal meaning across, then yes, I would be all for that. And great feedback there. Yes, I could use simpler words to state that.
Well, I wasn't actually, I didn't mean to provide feedback. I was just asking if that was something that you've noticed in creating policies before, considering your experience. I mean, it's easy to say when I'm looking at 4 sentences and I haven't.
It's hard. It is hard when writing policy to not fall back to legal verbiage. So I agree that it is 100% something to strive for. It is very hard to do. And when you are trying to deduplicate all of these different frameworks or control libraries and come up with a comprehensive list, a lot of times it's, and you are time bound, etc., resource bound on accomplishing something, it's very easy to copy paste and then maybe just tweak a little bit. And so that happens more times than not. But I know when I've been, I luckily am not writing our policies. I'm writing our standards. I'm not writing our policies. But when I'm going through the policies and providing feedback, because as an SME, I am required or requested to do so, I have called that out sometimes. I'll be like, I don't know what this means. Or, there's been some cases you're missing a verb. It doesn't seem like I can test this. It's not actionable. Or it's just overly complicated. Or many times, this is a huge run-on sentence. Could you please find a period somewhere? So I would not say that it is at the forefront of my mind to simplify this, but if I can't read it and understand it, then I can't use it either.
It's got to be like a proper balance, due to, it's got to be easy for them to read, easy to know, but at the same time, it's still a document that if needed in court still needs to have like the legal framework. So it's like finding the sweet spot, the proper balance where the legality is there, but at the same time, it's easy to read. And that's a very sensitive way of trying to juggle it. Because sometimes these can come up in a court case and say, oh, I didn't know, I didn't need to know. So they have to look at it and be like, well, was this clear enough for an individual to understand? And does these meet, requirements that we can say, yes, this is a legal standing?
So I just pulled up another example here. I'm not displaying it, but I wanted to pull it up. So PCI has a control that's talking about what it calls non-console administrative access. And when I first read this, I was like, I have no clue what that is. And I had to go look it up. And I don't remember off the top of my head what it is either. It's if I remember right, it's basically where you are not physically, you don't have hands-on keyboard and mouse that's physically plugged into a computer. So you have administrative access to a system, but you're not touching the actual keyboard and mouse. You're going over a remote desktop, or you're using some other remote access tool, or you're SSHing into the machine, whatever. So then they've got controls that are applicable. But that's a good example in my mind, at least, of wording that really, without a definition, and they don't define it very well at all, it is very hard to know what they mean. And where I had to I researched online, but if I couldn't find it there, I'd have to go to our auditor and say, what are you looking for? I have no idea what I'm supposed to do here. So I agree. And we do try to call out at the bottom of every policy and standard, here are key words. It's not just the acronyms, but what do we mean when we say a trusted network versus untrusted network, for example, right? The way we define it, if I remember correctly, is a trusted network is a network where we manage all the devices on that network. So we have full control. An untrusted network would be like a guest network where it's a Wi-Fi and I don't control the device that hops on or hops off. So you have to define those terms, because to the I might be a developer that's reading this for the first time, and yeah, I may know what OWASP is, for example, and know what the top 10 vulnerabilities are in code, but because I phrased something that's applicable to security and not to development, I may not know what that is. So we do try to catch those as much as possible and define them.
Well, it's very insightful that at least everybody's has trouble with it, because I thought I was the only one. So.
No. All right. We're getting close to the end here. So talking about enforcement. There's a number of different ways to enforce policy. I talk about a bunch of them here. I wanted to try to give a high-level process, though, for, okay, you found something that we think does not meet policy. What do we do about it? So there's an initial decision that has to be made. Is this something that really needs to be remediated, or is it okay? Maybe it's not really a gap, or maybe it's a gap, but it's not really required in policy. It could be a number of reasons why we don't actually have to fix it. Let's assume we do. I'm very simplifying this process. So we decide it needs to be remediated. We now document it. We need to determine a mitigation plan. We have to go implement that mitigation, validate that it actually has been properly closed out, and then close it out in our tracking process, essentially. So going back up to the top, policy can be enforced many different ways. You have just the leadership of the company showing how they are meeting policy. This is spoken about in policy literature about as a big need. I think HBR, for example, Harvard Business Review has a couple articles about this. Et cetera, around different ways to approach implementing and enforcing policy. And one of the big ones to call out is if you don't walk the walk, people are not going to, follow along behind you. Obviously, you have technology-based enforcement, right? You can say firewalls, you can't have any remote desktop protocol exposed to the internet. Well, that could be in policy, but then I can also enforce it with my firewall and just block the RDP port from ever leaving my internal network. You have compliance that sits there and audits. You have internal audit, which may look at some security controls on top of security compliance. You have line manager enforcement. So as a manager, if I notice that somebody's not following a policy, I can let them know. And then obviously if they were to continue to not be compliant, then there would be an HR issue. But ideally, I cut them off and say, nope, this is not what we do, and this is how you should handle it, and they move forward. You can have end user training to try to explain to people, here's what policy includes, this is how it's relevant to your role, this is what you need to be compliant with, this is the documentation we need, etc. There's self-reporting. Hey, I think I just did something and I think that it was out of compliance with policy, or I found something. It's actually interesting. We were looking at the standards and we had a control. I'm trying to remember how we phrased it, but basically that a IHG colleague, so it could be a contractor, it could be an employee, is not allowed to conduct penetration testing or vulnerability scanning without prior approval. Great, but the way we had phrased it, it sounded like if I was on our website making a hotel reservation and I found a security vulnerability by accident, then that could be construed as penetration testing and I could get in trouble, even though I wasn't really trying to pen test. But the reality is that I essentially accomplished the same thing. How would I go about self-identifying or self-reporting this issue? So we had to rework the standard control to allow for accidental or even just becoming aware of something, however way it happened, as long as you weren't actively trying to penetration test or conduct a vulnerability scan without authorization, you are okay. And then policy can be basically fixed, if you will, by remediation via the findings management process we walked through. Any questions on this?
You know, Yusuf, this is Robert Roberts again. It's funny you put executive modeling of behaviors. In my experience, I found the executives are the most ones who abuse the policies. You know,
I 100% agree. 100% agree. I can tell you right now of SVPs today at my company that use their personal machines instead of managed devices, all sorts of policy violations. 100%
email.
agree.
I remember when I was at the bank, they would want, I want to get, confidential information on my personal email. I don't want to have to log in and get an actual company email. Just send it to my personal. Things of that nature.
Absolutely true. Doesn't mean that they, it's okay. And ideally they should be modeling it, but I agree. It does happen, unfortunately. All right, last topic here, exceptions. So if you can't meet or will not meet a policy requirement, what do? You have lots of different options. You can do nothing. That's really just accepting the risk. If you are aware of it and you do nothing, you have risk accepted. You can change the existing policy depending on what it is to try to align with the reality of the situation. So maybe we found out we really can't do this technically. We wrote the control to say we do it. It's not technically possible. We came up with a mitigation. We're going to change the policy. You can document it in the risk register. Usually in a risk register, you're going to say, well, we know about this risk. Here's our timeline and plan on how we're going to go remediate it. It's usually used for something that's much longer in timeline or much more extensive than just a general gap that can be remediated quickly, like a finding. And you can also document the exception to the policy just with an exception expiration date to basically say, we're going to revisit this in a year, but we're not going to do anything about it in the meantime. We're just risk accepting. All of those are the exact same thing. We're accepting the risk of the immediate situation, and we either are committing to a future date or we're ignoring it until something forces us to go back and revisit it. So it is appropriate to approve a policy exception as part of a formal process. And that documentation of that process should actually be in the policy itself, so everybody's clear on how that works. And the process should include who's responsible and accountable for accepting that risk on behalf of the organization and what documentation requirements you need to be able to document that exception in a way, ideally, that's heading off that auditor that says, well, you had it in policy, but you didn't do it. Yes, we know, we had it documented. This is our plan. This is what we were doing to mitigate it in the short term and how we're dealing with it. Any questions on that? Okay. Summarize. Congratulations, you are still awake. Policy is not the most exciting subject out there at all. To recap, they're the rules that help an organization make logical decisions. They empower us as management to hold the organization accountable. They do have serious legal implications, as we talked about. They should ideally be based as much as possible on a regulatory or industry standard. Like I said, if you find that you have 3 authority documents that you're aligning to, but there's a specific control that you feel is appropriate for your organization that's not included, by all means include it, right? You can go above and beyond. Remember that compliance is the bare minimum that's required for security. You can go above and beyond that as well. You do have that fiduciary duty to protect the systems and information. And then policies are living, breathing documents. They will change over time, and you have to maintain them, you have to enforce them, and every once in a while you get overruled and you may not change them, but you just live with it and you move forward. All right, so I've got contact information here. Feel free to reach out to me, always happy to connect. And any questions?
Excellent talk, Josef. Really appreciate it. Any questions from any of the students or other participants that you'd like to bring up that we didn't cover along the way?
Something that's not really, as far as procedural, just a general question. I'm having trouble right now with GRC at my job, and how do you step back from this, I guess, sometimes, and try to balance security versus business need? I mean, is there like a secret way to do this? To me being in security, I'm passionate about security, and so I'm always screaming at the top of the lungs, security first. And business people, they just want their things to work. How do you find that balance, and how do you navigate those waters, if you will?
Oh boy, that's a hard one. I mean, keeping it very general, security is always a balance between, like you just said, the risks versus the benefits, right? And so the benefit to the business may be more money or more customers or more whatever, but there is a risk associated with doing business. Just by setting up your business, by going into business, you are accepting some risk. And so there is always risk. And the question is what is the risk appetite of the organization, of the business? What are they comfortable with? And as security, what I find is the best way to approach it is, can you lay out a logical argument that explains that risk to them in a way they can understand? As long as I feel comfortable that they understand the risk and they obviously are, the right person to accept that risk for the organization, then they get to make that decision. All I can do is educate them. If I'm having a lot of trouble educating them and they don't seem to understand it, or they're not the right person, but they're trying to make the decision anyways, then partnering with other people is usually the right way to do it, trying to find out who is the right person to make that decision, or finding somebody else that might be able to help make that logical argument to them to explain it. Because it's okay to recognize that sometimes you're not the best at describing something, or you just can't seem to get it across. Somebody else might be able to.
Thank you.
Sure. I don't have a great answer, unfortunately. There's no secret.
Well, I have a battle on my hands right now, so I was trying to figure out, how can I?
I do find drawing pictures, I don't care what you're doing, if you can draw a picture and clearly label it all, then that usually goes much farther than any words you could say.
And that's kind of why, right, you would do your whole risk management, assessment and come up with that matrices with the risk score on and justifying it and explaining the little details on each one, so you visually see it, so they can find an equilibrium on, what they feel is safest and what's not, right?
You're thinking of like maybe even doing a heat map of it, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you do your risk assessment, for example, whatever it is whether it's a vendor or an internal issue or system, what have you, and you're showing red all over, people are going to sit up and wake up and say, why are we red? What's wrong? What do I have to do to make this go away? And so it at least gets the conversation going, for sure.
Well, I think part of what he's asking about and what you're talking about is just the fact that business is in the business to take risk, right? And a lot of them consider this normal risk of doing business, and some of those implications nowadays have much further reaching, right? If you're doing business with a company gets breached through ransomware and suddenly your documents are exposed because they're an authorizing company and you're having to deal with that, it wakes.
So
the more they see it and the more they deal with it and the more that they can understand it, I think it helps.
9 times out of 10, the person is willing to take the risk because they don't actually understand the situation. That's what I have found. A good example is bring your own device, right? So portable devices have been around now 10 plus years at least. Laptops have been around even longer. And this is not a new issue, if you will, but I guess it's relatively new. Companies still don't seem to know how to handle this well. You either say, I'm going to allow you to use your own device, and I'm not going to worry about it, and you just take a risk on individual devices getting compromised, or we say, no, we have to lock it down. You can only use the managed device. So even if I let you bring your own hardware, I'm going to put managing solutions on it so that I can control it to the nth degree. Finding that happy middle ground to say, you know what, maybe the risk is it's only my IT admins, because they're the only ones that I care about. If their credentials get breached and their multi-factor on their device get breached, they're the only ones that are actually going to go do any harm. Worst case scenario, somebody that's a non-admin gets their device breached, then what are we going to lose? We're going to lose maybe 1,000 contacts. We're going to lose some emails. Yes, there may be 1 or 2 documents in there that is confidential, but for the most part, our confidential information doesn't go in email. I'm not too worried. That might be a risk you're willing to take. Now, you might include VIPs, your CEO, so maybe your treasury head, your CFO, whatever. You don't want them using their own device. That makes sense. They have information sooner than other people that might be impactful, that you don't want getting out. So you might protect those as well. But you can classify the risk and decide, is there a balance that I can achieve here where I don't have to go to the nth degree of security and I don't have to just ignore it and hope nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very hard. It really depends on every situation. I deal with this every single day. I get probably 3 to 6 new projects a week come through, and we have to do at least a high-level triage to say, do I care? Do I want to look at this or not? And if I do care, what are the high-level issues at stake here? And do I need to dig in, or can I provide you a standard and say, nope, just got to meet this?
Okay, Yosef, thank you for the great talk and the good Q&A discussion. Really appreciate it. So we're going to spin this session down, the presentation portion. And those of us that are part of the workshop,